Hello listeners, and welcome to this bonus episode of the Shephard Defence podcast. Today we have a truly fascinating conversation for you between August Cole, an author exploring the future of conflict through novels and other forms of fictional intelligence storytelling, and Dr. Keith Deer, Managing Director of the Centre for Cognitive and Advanced Technologies at Fujitsu UK. This conversation was recorded as part of a wider project developed by Shephard Studio. If you'd like to learn more about the themes discussed, head over to our specially developed website, digitalreadiness.tech. There you will find 5 content packages exploring what happens when technology challenges us to do things differently. The articles feature embedded video and audio players and some stunning imagery, so it's definitely worth checking out. That's at digitalreadiness.tech. Now, on with the show.
Hey, thanks, Jack, and hi, August. Great to see you again. So, look, we're picking up a conversation that we've had in various forums now, going back to when we did the play in London, right? Where we're exploring the future of AI through theatre, which is tremendous fun. But since then, there's been quite a lot going on in your life. There's been Burning Book and Ghost Fleet, and I think I've moved on from working in defence to various other roles. And I guess when I look back on it, I like my job now is delivering digital transformation. But I don't want to answer this question for you because I read the books and I think there's so much in here. But like for you, what do the experiences of writing Burning Book and Ghost Fleet and the books themselves tell us about digital transformation?
Well, Keith, you're right. I mean, we've had this running conversation, and it's one that I've enjoyed in the past, and I know is going to continue into the future. And this is a perfect opening for it. You know, both novels are fundamentally about the stakes and potential mistakes of digital transformation in defense and security, not just for a nation, but really, you know, in the global sense. You know, they're both cautionary tales, I think, with clear lessons. And the way that we wrote them is we used real world technologies, you know, either in development or actually available now, so that there's a kind of credibility to understanding how fast the future can move. And I think that's what we're living through in many cases right now. There's an aspect to both books, I think, that's really important, and that's in their utility. And it's a funny thing to say about something that's, you know, supposed to be enjoyable to read on a summer vacation, but it has, you know, endnotes. It has, you know, real linkage to the kinds of themes that are front and center for, you know, the national security community. And this is vital because, you know, you think about when you're talking about change, especially when you're involving technology, there's a human dimension and there's always conflict. And that doesn't mean the kind of conflict we'd even talk about in Burn-In, where it's quite extreme, but rather even organizations where, you know, if status quo is persisting or there's, you know, reluctance to, you know, see the world as it is versus as how, you know, how we want it, which is something that fiction, I think, can help break. It also is a reminder, too, that a competitor or an adversary, you know, as the adage goes, they get a vote. But what happens, though, truly, if they have the upper hand or if they're exploiting the inability to change? That, to me, that latter point is really crucial. And so that leads to all kinds of like lessons and I think insights in and around everything from the strategic aspects of hubris, right, how that can lead you astray, to the very tactical, which is what is it like to trust a software system or an AI system with your life? Those are sci-fi-like dimensions that are very much, you know, becoming part of our everyday lives.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the footnoted approach or endnoted approach is key to the success of your kind of that idea of fictional intelligence. It's not wild imaginings of the future. It's rooted in the present and saying, hey, here are the thin wisps of tomorrow that we can grasp, and if we follow them, this is where it might take. And like for me, leading digital transformation, the way we think of transform. I mean, we had a whole series called modernization is not transformation. I think that was it. Digitization is not transformation, but you get the general idea. Like you start with the strategy and then you go, okay, well, if this is the strategy, this is what we want to achieve. What do we need to get there? But even that strategy, that vision, all of it needs to be rooted in the now, so that there's something realistic that says, well, if we follow those trails. And for me, the strength of your books and our conversations over the years is that they give you that, they take that starting point, they give you a vision, and then they help you to work back to, well, what does that mean for us now? Not just what does it mean for us then, what does it mean for us now? And I think that's key when we think about digital transformation, and it's why these are so powerful. I guess it's why we're here as well. So, yeah. I was wondering, like, when you think about the future, we're often told like the speed of technological change is ever increasing, or there's the technology adoption curve is going up. Everything is being pulled out the lab faster. And part of my job now is to do exactly. Let's go find stuff in the lab that might revolutionize how we make decisions. Say, how can I get that out and scale it with our partners rapidly and faster than we have in the past? But it strikes me that must be a real challenge for science fiction writers, because you're trying to write things down that. You had a whole Twitter thing for a while. This is your Ghost Fleet moment of the day, and it felt like things that you were suggesting might take place and not specified, but broadly 10 years in the future. They keep happening. So how much of a challenge is that? Do you go back? Do you have to keep redrafting? Like how do you do that?
This is a fascinating moment to be writing about the future, because the gap between what is possible and what is happening all around us is narrowing and harrowing, right? I mean, this is one of the best examples of this recently was a research article about some Swiss researchers that essentially, trained, I don't know if it was a neural net, but an AI system to create bioweapons, molecules that were going to be deadly to humans. In 6 hours, they created like 40,000 different, potential weapons. And it so, shocked them. They like stopped the experiment, destroyed much of the data, but they immediately published on it, which was helpful. I couldn't make that up literally. I mean, I could, but like if I presented that, to somebody in a story that a sinister villain was, not just brewing anthrax in a bathtub, which was the paradigm of, 20 years ago, but something like this. So I think from, a national security perspective, though, it's also really important to be able to, take that mindset, though, to be able to kind of sit on the other side of the table or look at things from an adversary point of view, because, you don't want to, essentially use that narrowing gap between reality and science fiction to write things that are so dystopian that people are paralyzed. And I think this is a bigger kind of message about when you're thinking about futures and understanding that, our sense of agency, right, and what is coming is really important. This is, I think, a big issue in this question of digital transformation. Is it being done to people, or are people participating in it? And of course, how we see ourselves in our own stories is vital. In the same way that, innovators, have often a very heroic identity, and they're kind of battling against forces larger than themselves, which, this is, the innovator's journey, not unlike the hero's journey. Yeah. So I think that's a really important aspect too, is to see that delta, that gap between reality and imagination as being a place to work and moving us towards the kind of futures we want. I mean, I say that, right, as somebody who writes the kinds of tomorrows that I want to avoid. Quite often I do aspirational type writing too, particularly around space. But fundamentally, we are at a point where that gap is only going to grow narrower. And so then the most important thing I think a sci-fi writer or a useful fiction writer can do, is to really focus again on what is it like to live in that world. Yeah, it's very easy when people are thinking about the future or messaging it, to really lose sight of that. And fundamentally, that kind of a transformative vision of the future will never succeed, I think, unless it really is in that kind of inclusive sense, thinking about that way of actually experiencing it, from a human-centered point of view.
Yeah. So, I mean, trying to make, I like narrowing and harrowing. Is that what you said? Yeah, that's good. I'm trying to make it a less harrowing experience for individuals by making them feel like they're a part of it. It's not a thing that's being done to them. It's neat. That Swiss lab, at the risk of taking us off on a massive tangent, that Swiss lab thing was really interesting, right? Because I remember sharing that paper. Is it the one that became a Nature paper? Is that what we're talking about?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. So I remember sharing that with people, and there are plenty of people like, oh my God, that's incredible. And then there are others who are like, what? How did these guys not know that was like, how did they not imagine? And I won't go into the specifics of this, but I had an experience with you can tell he's an ML researcher because of the way he framed it, but we'd hit a challenge with one of the researchers that we work with. And he said, Keith, I just don't have that mental model. That's just not how I think about the world. So like what you're telling me, yes, maybe I should have worried about it, but we weren't, just to be really clear, we weren't designing like, pandemics in a lab or anything like that. But it was related to an AI ML technology. So it didn't occur to me. I don't have the mental model that you have to think about it in the context of national security, but I guess you're right. Maybe I should worry about that. And I guess if there's a point to that, it's one of the things you help with is for people who don't have that mental model, to gain one, to begin to see what they're doing, which they think of as from a narrowly scientific perspective. It's all about human progress, but say, hang on, actually, like this is what you're doing now, what it might mean. Is that something you encounter with readers that have sort of bumped into your books in that way? Perhaps not from the obvious national security community who are all like going out and buying it to go read it on the beach, but others. Is that a thing that you?
Yeah, you've seen a real increase in interest in especially kind of founder level investment in the national security and technology space, and both books, particularly Burn-In, though, have resonated, I think, with people in those communities, in part because it allows somebody who is trying to understand how a specific technology fits within a larger system. A good novel, a good story is quite like holistic, right? It has all these different elements. It has details that draw on our senses. It puts people's individual actions in greater context, like societies, et cetera. And so to be able to understand, for example, how like augmented and virtual reality might work in America of the 2030s, you start to really think about the relationship between an individual and their personal technology. Where do economics and stratification fit into that? Might it be, for example, like we have in Burn-In, a scene in which people who are wealthy are looking at the world through augmented reality. Those who can't afford such systems are staring down at their phones. Right, a small example, but I think it really speaks to the value that understanding the social dimensions of innovation, can have when you're looking at narrative. And look, this is crucial. I mean, we've seen it with the explosion of social media platforms and their misuse or maluse by actors, who want to spread disinformation or sow dissent. I often wonder, if you had a much more rigorous conversation about the perils, the duality, the dual use. In certain defense, realms, we think explicitly about dual use characteristics and whether that restricts something for exports. Drones are a perfect example. What if that was also taken upon individuals in the civilian innovation community, right? The market, to think about that. The could-should aspect of technology innovation, I think, is crucial, and more so as that gap narrows again between imagination and reality.
I think that's right. And look, to give an example of how that kind of has influenced me. Two of the things we wrote about in the integrated review, so working out Downing Street, writing the UK's international strategy, we had two concepts which I think are not new, but ways of reconceptualizing and reframing things to draw attention to them. So one was this idea of systemic competition, which I think comes through more strongly in Burn-In than it does, I think, in Ghost Fleet. But the idea that adversaries of various kinds, whether both organised crime, state, and the nexus in between those two things, deliberately seek to exploit the seams and silos in your system. And that sometimes that's the state, that's the gaps between department and the gaps in legislation, really deliberately. But sometimes equally, it's like it's in the technological elements, and like a thing that speaks back to, and it's like, so yeah, systemic competition was one of those concepts, and this wider definition of national security. Like we deliberately had the first chapter of science, technology, and data as the first chapter in the integrated review. And to our knowledge at the time, it was like the first international strategy that had put that quite so central. And there's a demonstration of that today. As reading, so the FT this morning ran a story on why we should be much more worried about the Internet of Things. So, Huawei being pushed out of our network. So now actually the next thing is our Internet of Things might pose an even bigger threat, and another technology vector. And it's like, it's whack-a-mole, right? Like you're like, hey, we fix this thing and we fix this thing. But all of these things are like come out in your books earlier. I had a retired air marshal the other day to me saying to me the other day, do you know what, Keith, an F-35 could potentially be grounded by like flaws in its semiconductors. And I'm like, yeah, that not only could that happen, but everything else in Ghost Fleet seems to be happening. So maybe that's next. But it highlights, there's things you wrote in that book that this is almost a meta conversation, but I suspect you've in some way that idea is flowing back out from senior people because the ideas are now out there in a way that they weren't before. You said, hey, this is with thin wisps of tomorrow, again, pulling and following them and going, okay, this is what this looks like. Yeah,
the hardware vulnerability, in the supply chain is, I think, a good example of that. And, one of the larger, challenges sometimes if you're a senior leader is you might identify a risk like that, but how do you galvanize an organization, right? Yeah. How do you get people to also have that same sense of urgency to commit budget, resources, social capital inside? And, what a book like Ghost Fleet did in that particular case was it allowed people in the Office of Secretary of Defense who were very interested and worried about that issue to literally be able to pass the book to somebody and say, we got to talk about supply chain vulnerability. No, we don't. Read this and you'll want to talk about it. And I think that's another example. And there's other technologies in that book too, I think around swarming, autonomous, surface vessels, but even kind of tactical paradigms, like what is it going to be like operating in an environment where we have degraded or no GPS or no over the horizon situational awareness. That's a out there idea, especially back in 2013, 2014 when we were writing the book before it came out in 2015. Now, thankfully, that's something that is regularly integrated into different military communities. And in fact, paradoxically, you're pushing more responsibility and technology down to small units, and at the same time finding that need to be able to operate with a map and compass all the same and communicate with like literally Morse code, just to stay off the grid, just not to emit, just not to be able to be sensed. And so, I think this tension between those two elements was certainly present in Ghost Fleet and very deliberate, because the old and the new are with us all the time. You can still listen to AM radio in your Tesla. You're just listening to it over a Wi-Fi network, a 5G or 6G network. And I think people often forget that, especially when they really get in love with a certain technology, is to kind of lose sight of that bigger picture.
Yeah. So, I mean, firstly, I think you're thinking about what the actual effects of some of the things in Ghost Fleet. If it means we end up planning the next war from the pub in the UK, then I'm up for it, and I'm glad I stayed in the reserve. But I think one of the things that thoughts you sparked in me there is the way that you're creating different realities, even as like ones that are currently being sort of more solidified are challenging things that are otherwise solidifying. So an example is we for a long time in defence, national security, have been talking about the geo singularity, right? This point where like every inch of the earth is constantly watched, and what do you do when a mad science had that famous hiders versus finders theme for a while, which is great and really interesting. And defence absolutely needs to think about like, what does it mean when you can't move without somebody knowing where you are? But I mean, you and Ukraine right now, that's a friend of mine says there are no lessons from Ukraine. You need to think of it like it's sui generis and it won't ever look like that again, which I think is an interesting idea. But the Ukraine conflict is highlighting that hiders versus find. What does it mean when you can't hide? Whereas your book says, well, hang on a minute, what does it mean when you can't see? And that's like that constant tension in war between one concept and another. And actually, you have to be thinking you need both narratives to run, and you need to have thought through how you fight in both eventualities, because we can't be sure. So I guess in some ways, what we usually help to pull out is dueling realities and dueling narratives within the same story.
I think there's a clear duality present in both those stories and in the evolution of security and particularly warfare. Ukraine, to your point, I think is a really interesting lesson in that. On one hand, you can look at, for example, the proliferation of commercial satellite imagery as being decisive, and it is. And what's interesting is the enabling technology is not so much the hardware that's orbiting, but it's the AI systems that are sifting and sorting, using image recognition to figure out what's important. Similarly, though, you can identify that as being transformational in that conflict, but also recognize in that conflict, those assets are not contested, right? Those commercial companies have not been attacked, either physically or electronically. And so in the context of how, a given campaign by an adversary or a global conflict over time. So this temporal aspect, all those things on the temporal plane, can be true simultaneously because they're happening at different times. And I think that kind of escalation, that escalatory, de-escalatory, rhythm, whether it's tidal or whether it's more abrupt, like an earthquake, it depends on kind of your vision of how warfare in a given scenario might evolve. But it's crucial to be able to have a dynamic enough mindset, let alone an organization that can handle both, to have a leader that can navigate that world in which they may be heavily reliant on their software systems, their AI essentially to help them make decisions, and yet 5 minutes later be able still to trust their gut. I mean, that's really hard, right? And especially when you're flooded with data to the point about IoT, where we are going to have now this like way opening aperture to see the world differently. And we look at it again from a human cognition point of view, and this is more your lane than mine, certainly. But how machines, quote unquote, see the world is also crucial to start to understand and figure out how to communicate back to humans what they're seeing. And this ability to understand how a user, and this is where I love design for this reason, and trying to integrate these principles into fiction, is that it really makes you think about that user experience. So how does someone at a very tactical level, about to breach a building, need to understand their digital environment, all the IP addresses, the spectrum around them versus, someone back in an operations center, 10 clicks away to somebody, 2,000 miles away. So all that, variability, also overlays on the temporal too. And again, not to be too meta, right? But I think this is really the way you have to kind of look at these dynamics.
No, I like the duality idea. It's that thing I overquote of F. Scott Fitzgerald with the sign of a truly fine intellect being the ability to hold two competing ideas in mind at the same time and retain the ability to function. I mean, I think that's going to be I mean, that has always been true, hence F. Scott Fitzgerald, long before we were really thinking about AI in detail, but is becoming even more so because you'll have different realities, different challenges in different parts of the battlefield at the same time, some that are transparent and some that are utterly opaque, and trying to cope with having more data than you've ever had before and also cope with complete blind spots is something that we're going to have to get used to training people for. I think it's a really interesting idea. I'm going to segue to getting us back on track for some of the things we said we'd cover. You asked for sort of a couple of examples from your writing on how machines outperform humans. That's my thing. That's what I'm interested in. So, but how humans respond and what you think we might draw from the lessons that you've kind of written about, and as you imagine these things. So, are there a couple of examples that we might draw out, August?
Yeah, I think a lot of it goes, back to that management of information. In Burn-In, you have a counterterrorism agent who's partnered with, a biped robot that has kind of a buddy cop dynamic to it in the book. But really, what's interesting about that relationship, it's fundamentally about that FBI agent Laura Keegan's relationship and trust in data, because the robot is effectively almost like an avatar to access that, and that is in many ways what becomes, I think, really interesting, is how someone who's pursuing a target has to learn to trust that system to give them the information they need, whereas they may have in the past been able to rely on instinct, or again, seen the limitations of what they knew, but been able to work around that. Because suddenly, and especially, in like a video game, when you're playing along, to different levels and your character gets more powers the longer, stays alive the longer you play. Similarly in Burn-In, Laura Keegan levels up with Tams, her robot. The robot, through the story gets access to more and more data. So we're really trying to show not only that ability to access more information, but also how, in effect, you're able to learn to trust it. The more it's right, the more it's right. And I think this is one of the abiding questions, though, about this aspect of machine performance relative to human performance is, if the machine can outperform you, but you don't trust it, it doesn't matter. If you don't have confidence. And I think that, is in perhaps my layperson's point of view, but it really does feel, especially in the future when we have more everyday robotics, finding edge in that sense, like who can have the little bit of an advantage will become easier, right? Because of the ubiquity. But at the same time, I think we aren't going to change that fast in the next 20 years, where we're still going to have, I think, always that sense of like, do I understand this to be true or not? The narrative side is a really good example. The latest large language models. I don't know if you've tracked, I'm sure you have Bloom, an open sourcing, system that, I don't know how many languages, 46 and I think 16 programming languages, now gives the ability to, use text generation, tools that were really in a handful of just a few, 4 or 5 years ago. And I think about that along with tools like DALL-E for image generation. And then that leads me to your point about systemic competition, about like cognitive warfare and the ability to shape information, use, small amounts of data to target individuals at scale. And this is something that I've written about in a few different stories as well, that I think is a crucial aspect of the future of warfare it is underappreciated for its relevance and its power. It doesn't have the same discussion as the killer robots debate, but it's potentially more consequential at a global scale, given the software and data that, is lining up to be increasingly available. So it's not just a nation state, that is, applying this either domestically or internationally, but suddenly small groups or back to the group of Swiss researchers, maybe even an individual who can harvest off the shelf tools and still have, outsized effects. That to me is I think a really interesting, way to think about it. And I've done a lot of fiction writing for NATO Allied Command Transformation on this, because, that's one of the communities that's quite acutely focused on it. And narrative can be really good at that, because it can show it, again, how do you understand a form of warfare that is human-centric more than machine or territory-centric.
So there's so much there, and it's so rich. I don't know where to begin in responding, but I'm going to throw the scripts out the window and just chat, I think. Look, it makes me think of a few things. There's a really interesting blog post, which you probably know, about Eric Huell's thing, where he's like asking what it means to be a good writer in the context of large language models. And he says, yeah, sure, it's probably not going to produce something, like he says, I work really hard on these blog pieces and I try to make them creative and I try to make them thoughtful and it's probably not going to produce something of the quality of this. And it might not be producing something of the quality to, I don't know, whether it's like the Wall Street Journal or it's probably not going to consistently produce at the point where it makes the top journalists redundant. But on the other hand, it's going to produce content at such a pace and scale And sometimes, you know what, quite a lot of writers aren't paid to produce these like fine works of art they spend forever on. It's just like, we've just got to get stuff out. And that begins to change the ecosystem. Of course, the more that they do that, the better they're getting, because they're getting data on feedback on what works. And so, now you're saying, well, that gap, his point is probably there will be an element of that that is retained for the human, but because for a whole raft of different reasons, and he may or may not be right. But I think he's definitely right about that idea that, like, well, when you say what a great writer is, you need to remember there are different types of great writers, and actually just volume and speed is part of that, and you can forget keeping up in that. Like, it's just not going to happen. So if we kind of draw that across to the way we think about warfare, if Clausewitz tells us that, we talked about this at the Defence Academy when we're talking about multi-domain integration. If Clausewitz tells us that war is politics by other means, or policy, depending on which translation you read, and if we conceive of that as being, well, politics or policy, the attempt to persuade someone to do just something differently to what they were doing before, then everything we do becomes an informational input to the cognitive domain. And now we've got a whole raft of things, from the story generation, the stuff that might appear on social media, which is one end of it, but equally the message that you might send and communicate through your actions. And that's a very different, you're writing the narrative through what you do. And I think that becomes really rich when you think about human strengths and limitations in relations to machines.
It's a reframing of sorts, right? I mean, you can think about, again, this notion of, we're all the heroes of our own stories is quite literally being true, especially in that kind of analysis sense of how a machine might see an individual or a collective, acting. And, to me, when we're again looking at the duality of modern conflict, it's a world in which, those sorts of cognitive campaigns will be waged. They'll be very difficult to defend against, especially in Western societies. And at the same time, we still might be fighting over rocks in the South China Sea, right? And I think that's a really crucial thing to always, kind of remember. And again, the Ukraine conflict, I think, offers some of this too. You can have AI, image, generation and very advanced, boutique electronic warfare, but also trenches and mortars and unguided artillery, being also decisive, or, brutality being wielded as a weapon by the Russians. And so this is, I think, the challenge in the futures community, because you can have very technology driven audiences that want to be spoken to in the languages they understand, but sometimes they need to hear more about, the more simple aspects of the future that look like the past. And, from a step back perspective, and even considering, these really kind of complex theories and ideas, one of the things that I often do when I feel a little bit backed into a corner or overwhelmed is I'll go back to history. And particularly like 20th century military history, but even further back, and just kind of ground myself a little bit to understand, the past is not always prologue, but there's echoes. Particularly doing writing on things like future special operations. The way we look at that now is so different, because bureaucratically, talk about transformation. The community and special operations forces, in the Western militaries have proved their worth, so to speak. But now they're reassessing. What is the value? What is the relevance? And that's not unlike back where we were in the, kind of early 1940s, when, particularly in the UK with the SBS and the SAS, the Long Range Desert Group, they had to kind of prove their worth, because they had never existed before. And I think that mindset of really kind of understanding the echoes is crucial in understanding some of these facets of future conflict, that it's okay to be overwhelmed by it because it is overwhelming, but also to know that there's ways we can kind of try to identify where the echoes are.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think rooting it in history, and equally, look, I mean, the other thing history can teach you is how fast technology can change at the same time, right? So sometimes you go back to, yes, it's reassuring. You can say, well, here are the things that look exactly the same, but you can also see whether it's the emergence of air power in the First World War, or on and on and on. The speed with which. Well, the other thing is the emergence of technology, and then the incorporation of it into combat. There's often quite a long lag. As what's the famous book on military revolutions? That's really fascinating on that. So you get the introduction of these new technologies, and then you get a very human element of people playing around and working out whether it's longbows, and then with Longshanks, there's a whole chapter on, longbows are around, everybody's using longbows, but they keep losing. And then eventually someone's like, here's how you use them. And suddenly everything changes. And that goes on. It goes on through artillery, it goes on through air power. And then you think, okay, well, I think that's probably where we are around a lot of the technologies that I think and write and talk about. I think we have ideas, thin wisps of tomorrow, that we grasp from books like yours and what they might mean. But then there's another layer to that, which is, okay, we can see that that's what they might mean and that's what they might do. But what we need to figure out now is, how do we actually adopt them? And then how do we integrate them? How do we test them until we can do those things that August has written about so eloquently? And the promise that they seem to yield, the realization of that is still a profoundly human endeavor for now, I think. But
I think this actualization, of the near future is really important, because it is easy to basket certain technologies, put quantum computing or some of the synthetic biology, and maybe even wider or broader AI into the category where those are often dismissed as having always been 5 or 10 years away, which I think is a cop out of an excuse. I mean, there may be echoes of truth to some extent, but that isn't really a helpful mindset. And rather, the mindset should be, what can we be doing now, especially in a very lean and aggressive and innovative way, to be experimenting and playing, with those capabilities. That's very hard for big organizations like militaries. It's a little easier for companies, but not always. And that is essential to this concept, I think, of digital transformation, that it's not like an edict, right, from on high that ultimately, allows that movement from, one mindset, one type of family of technologies, to another. Those can be generation long, but they are more successful in their transformation, I think, when there are individuals who are participating. It's that notion of agency again. They were actively enabling that change, participating in that change, driving it ideally, especially if it's bottom or middle up, rather than having it being done to them. And again, that's a little bit the burn-in mindset, that where, people get divorced from the potential technological benefits, right? And it's because it's captured by a few and kind of, done to everybody else. And that's a recipe for unhappiness, if not outright, instability, disaster, as we show. And so that's a really clear message, I think, that is not just, again, at the national level, but it's certainly institutionally relevant too.
I think also I think you've sparked things that people have said to me over the years that all come together in that. In like one of the things about people leading transformation. You remember a senior person a couple of years ago now, even then had retired from the military. We were listening to an Air Force conference, and yet another senior officer got up and talked about, well, I don't know anything about IT, but. And then on they went. He sort of looked to me afterwards. He's like, look, we're not of the generation. There's nobody in this room that's of the generation where computers didn't exist. Like, they have literally existed for their entire career. So that idea that you can stand up now and say, well, there's this thing and you need to take care of it, but I'm not going to. No, it involves you. Another friend was saying to me, look, it's these people who've left defence, then advocating back in, saying, there's only a few weeks ago, I was putting that guy's emails off for him to read because he didn't really know how to use. I think that participation and that credibility, you're right that you need the agency and the participation at the bottom. You need it at the top as well. And you need a particular kind of humility, not the kind of humility that says, I don't know anything about this, but, good luck, I can see it's important. The kind of humility that says, I don't know anything about this, but I'm going to learn with you. We're all ignorant and we're all trying to learn together. And here's the kind of thing I'm doing to try and use this technology in my work. I think it's really key. So I think you're right to stress agency at the lower levels, but I think some of our senior leadership needs sometimes also to express that agency to lead this kind of change, not the decrying, I don't understand it and it's your problem, but good luck. It feels to me like that. Being willing to engage with it is a different kind of humility.
I think so. And the other aspect at that senior leader level is simply creating the time to be able to move away from, the inbox, quite literally. And I think this is one of the lessons learned over the last few years, and even going back to Go Sleep too, but finding ways to use story and narrative to do that, right? To communicate, like, this is an issue, whether it's a specific technology or a policy that is going to be, potentially transformational. But unless they can really see it, unless you can capture enough of their attention for 10 or 15 minutes, whether it's with a short narrative you've written, whether it's with, a conversation, video, whatever, the point is you're getting them to lift their eyes up and to look well beyond the horizon, but not so far off that they can discount, right, or dismiss what you're proposing, but rather enough to see what the stakes are, what the way forward is, and ultimately, how people might actually, be changed by it, right? I mean, those are pretty fundamental, I think, elements, but often lacking when we try to talk to senior leaders and convince them that, this is the most important thing they need to think about, not just today, but potentially for a whole year, not just the 4 quarters of the year or 3-month period. Those sorts of long versus short-term tensions will always be there, and those are incumbent, I think, on, the leader to manage those, but they can't ignore the future, at the expense of today.
Agreed. And you can't say it, so I will, and it starts with reading your books, right? So I'm going to go back to something really interesting where I think there's a kind of a rich vein of conversation, and then we'll have a little chat about that, and then maybe one last question and perhaps wrap up, conscious of time. But I think, look, one of the things you brought up was this idea of user experience, and I think we have to think about that much more broadly in a way, again, that your books do in your conversation earlier emphasized. Like, user experience does begin to mean not just, is it convenient? Is it smooth to use? Is it easy to pick up? It absolutely means all those things. And we as a tech company, Fujitsu, but more broadly, all tech companies and organizations that ease of use is really important. Otherwise, you get everything from the uncanny valley to just technology you don't know how to use, right? But there's another element to that as well, where I think it forces us to think a bit about how we make decisions as humans. So, like as a psychologist, when you talk about instinct, an example I gave for years was this. There's this example in amongst firefighters where a young guy goes running in or young girl goes running in and might charge into the building and go on, and suddenly the older one puts a hand on the shoulder to get out now, and they don't really know why, and they go running out and then the building collapses. But for me, that's like the canonical example of instinct informing a decision. And everyone's like, how did you know? But I would say there's a key there. It's always the older person grabbing the younger one. And if it's the other way around, it wouldn't work. And the reason it works is because that older person has more data, basically. It's doing pattern detection in masses of data. And okay, they're not consciously aware that what it is they've noticed. Maybe it's the smell, maybe it's the temperature, maybe it's something familiar from something they've seen before. But it's just pattern detection. So part of our UX needs to recognize what we mean when we say instinct, and therefore when we should trust ours and when we should trust the machines. And if you'll forgive me to other bits on that I thought that you sparked, and I scribbled down here. A friend of mine, Aaron Salaya, was studying at Oxford at the same time as me, and he was writing about trust in AI. And one of the things he was saying was that there's sometimes you trust, like what you have is this constant correction. So I think his experiments had like robots that guided you out of the airport in an active shooter situation. And he's like, sometimes people just blindly follow these robots for ages into like near certain death. He said, and then once they've realized that the machine's got it wrong, then they never trust it. And now there's no way of rectifying it. It's not like a human rebuilds trust with you in multiple ways in a way that a robot can't. And I think about that, and I think about affective computing, this whole domain where computers can read your face. Jonathan Gratch's work at USC, where computers can kind of read you better than you can read yourself. And I think we have to reconceive from the bottom up what we mean by UX, not just how we experience machines, but how machines experience us, and then how the two work out collectively, how to work together. And I think that's something you bring out really well in the books. But you made me reflect on it, and I thought those ideas might spark further ideas in you. So over to you.
There's a trinity I'm really interested in between neuroception, reinforcement learning, and haptics for how you essentially convince an individual to trust, to your point, that kind of deep well of data and experience that not just the sage mentor individually may have, but imagine being networked into a global group of firefighters who have collectively 1,000 years of experience, right? And imagine that data was even more precise, because even in the real-time moments of that burning building, you're understanding the structural risks because of all the sensors that are inside. So I mean, this is again a little more in the sci-fi realm, but close to proximate possibility. And neuroception is such a fascinating for me, as someone who's a very instinctive person, understanding how it's like when people ask, where did you get that idea? And a lot of times I'm like, I don't know, it's just it came out. But I'm constantly reading, constantly listening, constantly just kind of processing. Similarly, in situations where you may have physical danger or trying to kind of assess the environment, you may have like that spidey sense or gut feeling, as I talk to my daughters about. You have to trust it. And the fact that you can, again, allow an individual to access that knowledge, not through yet another screen or a visual interface or auditory, but relying on how our own, kind of extended, brain, if you will, functions, is fascinating. And so I have a fiction project I'm working on this currently, trying to kind of, play with this nexus of these three things, especially using like kind of information warfare in the tactical sense, to really understand your operating environment. So, this again is probably more in your lane, as it relates to neurology and such, but it instinctively, it feels like, we can't keep up with yet another screen, yet another, common operating picture or whatever, that we have to actually kind of transcend that. And I don't think deep brain interface stuff is near-term viable. That is one thing I think that will be harder to affect, just because it's typically so harmful. But short of that, if you're not going to break the blood-skin barrier, this kind of thing might be actually promising and useful. And
you have a whole story in the RISI journal this edition that we published, right? That has the
that's right, whole shot. Yeah, it was predicated.
That
same idea. Absolutely.
Yeah, people should read that too. By the way, it's great with the whole like rerun. Well, I won't give the punchline away, but people should read it. That's because that talks about haptics and cognition, and it's brilliant. Right, I'm gonna ask you a final question, and then to try and sort of get us this on track, and then we we can wrap up. But this is fascinating, and I wish we could talk more, because there's so much, as always, that you could dive into, and I certainly would learn a lot from. So the question, this is a genuine question, because I'm not sure from having read the books, but and even if it were, it would be interesting to get your reflections. If you rewrote Burn In or Ghost Fleet or Whole Shot or any of these stories over the years, I don't want to narrow it too much. There's so much that you've done, but would they change fundamentally as stories? Or is there anything that emerged in tech that changes the assumptions you built the story around? Yeah, I know we have like the genuinely entertaining "this is your Ghost Fleet" moment of the day, which for a few years just started to get a bit weird. I was slightly worried that you were a prophet, but and perhaps in some ways science fiction writers are. But I mean, is there anything in the inverse where you go, do you know what, I got that wrong, or I would change this, or it would change the story in this way?
This is something I think about all the time. I'm constantly, self-reflecting on this. And Ghost Fleet, there's a big one. To be fair, we wanted to write a 700-page book, and our publisher said, that's too long. There's a myriad reasons why. And we said, well, Red Storm Rising and Tom Clancy, that's 700-page book. He says, you're not Tom Clancy. So one of the things, though, that we didn't get to put in there, and that also would be simply, evolved based on what we've seen, but is the domestic scene in a third world war in the U.S. What would the political context be like, the information environment? How would people be exploiting that? We have some kind of very small references to it about people exploiting the isolationist tendencies in America to essentially let the Chinese, hold on to Hawaii. They're called 49ers in the book. But it's really just a sliver of the story. Yet I think it deserved to be much more. Similarly, the globally networked community of young people who are tethered through gaming and different platforms, whether it's handhelds. That was something I really wanted to do in there too. And Pete and I just got to a point where we couldn't cram it all into the book already. And other stories too. Whole Shot is one where I think developing that haptic fusion synthesis that I think is really, really important. In Burn In, one of the aspects I think that's really interesting that we didn't get to explore as much is simply the larger scope of America in the 2030s. Burn In is set in Washington, D.C. very deliberately, but I really wanted to, and still want to know, what's happening in Silicon Valley at that moment, what's happening in New York City and other places. Yeah. So, the story follows effectively a test of this robot, TAMS. And so what if the success of that test, which I would argue it was, is actually the worst thing for the country, right? What if, automation comes for law enforcement? And that would be a fascinating world to unpack, given all the politics and security, aspects of that in the US. So those are a couple of things there that certainly are really interesting. Maybe lastly, I think setting part of Ghost Fleet inside China, like an unconventional warfare campaign by the US or its allies, in the kind of high mountains or, in the South would have been pretty interesting too. But, yeah, I think about this a lot as well.
It's fascinating. And I said that slightly flippantly, thinking you're a prophet, but as I think about it more, actually, that's what science fiction writers are in many ways, right? You're imagining futures for us and helping us think about them in new ways, and hence you pick up followers. So maybe, what was your line earlier about history not repeating itself, but the echoes are there? So maybe that's what's happening here.
I think I'll need to start writing things that are more of what you call preferred futures or aspirational stories, if that's going to be the case.
Yeah, I think so. Otherwise, you're going to get some sort of path dependency towards your more dystopian tendencies. So here's to a more utopian August Cole in the future. This has been absolutely tremendous. So I think all that really remains for me is to say thanks so much for giving up your time to join us on the podcast. To join us for the conversation, regardless of the format that it comes out in. I've really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it last time we met down at the Staff College, and hopefully it won't be too long before we do this again.
Keith, this was a great conversation, and I look forward as well to catching up in person sooner than later.
Cool.
This conversation was recorded as part of a Shephard Studio project sponsored by Fujitsu Defense and National Security. If you'd like to learn more about the themes discussed, head over to our specially developed website, digitalreadiness.tech. There you will find articles, video, and audio players all wrapped up in an immersive web experience. That's digitalreadiness.tech. Thanks for listening.